April 30th, 1945, 10:45 a.m., Washington, D.C. A cold spring rain falls over the White House grounds. Inside the Oval Office, the lights are dimmed, the blinds are half drawn. The war has dragged on for nearly 6 years, and the man at the center of the Allied effort, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is no longer alive to see its end. 12 days earlier, on April 12th, Roosevelt collapsed at Warm Springs, Georgia. Now, his successor, President Harry S. Truman, sits behind the resolute desk, sifting through the last intelligence reports Roosevelt ever read. The room still carries traces of the former president, his cigarette holder on the mantel, his naval prints on the wall, his unfinished notes for a victory message resting on a corner table. At 10:48 a.m., a courier enters. He carries a single decoded message from Europe. The Soviet Union has taken Berlin. Truman's jaw tightens. Around him, his advisors wait, unsure of what this news, this moment, truly means. Germany is collapsing. Hitler is gone. Yet the cost has been unimaginable, and tensions simmer beneath the alliance that won the war. What Roosevelt said about this inevitable moment, what he predicted, what he feared, what he warned his generals and allies about, hangs over the room like an unfinished sentence. The rain taps against the window. No one speaks. Because Roosevelt's words, spoken in private meetings, correspondence, and strategic briefings long before his death, now return with prophetic weight. He saw Berlin's fall coming, but he also understood what it would unleash. The path to Berlin is long, brutal, and shaped by decisions Roosevelt makes years before the city falls. To understand Truman's reaction in April 1945, we must return to the strategic crossroads that define the Grand Alliance. It begins in 1943 at the Casablanca Conference. Roosevelt stands firm on unconditional surrender, a message aimed as much at Stalin as at Hitler. He believes Germany must be crushed completely, but he also understands what such a strategy will mean. The Soviet Union will carry the heaviest burden on the Eastern Front, and thus claim the deepest reach into Central Europe. Privately, Roosevelt expresses concern to his military advisors. According to accounts from Admiral Leahy and General Marshall, he warns that if the Soviets advance unchecked, they will naturally secure the political shape of whatever they liberate. By 1944, Stalin's armies are moving west with unstoppable momentum. Every mile gained by the Red Army is stained with a casualty rate the Western Allies could scarcely imagine. Roosevelt recognizes this reality and publicly praises the Soviet sacrifice. Yet behind closed doors, he voices a tension he never mentions in speeches. The war cannot be won without the Soviets, but winning with them will create a world shaped by their occupation zones. At Tehran in 1943 and later at Yalta in February 1945, this tension becomes strategy. Roosevelt negotiates directly with Stalin, relying on personal rapport, even charm, believing that post-war cooperation is possible if trust is established early. But he is no fool. He instructs his advisors to closely study Soviet intentions, especially regarding Germany's capital. He anticipates the Russian desire to take Berlin, according to notes from his senior aides, and acknowledges privately that geography and military reality favor the Red Army's approach. Meanwhile, Eisenhower's Western armies push across France after D-Day, but logistical bottlenecks and fierce German resistance slow the advance. By early 1945, despite Allied victories at the Bulge and in the Rhineland, Roosevelt sees a strategic truth forming. The race for Berlin may already be lost. Before his death in April, Roosevelt reportedly confides to a close aide, "Whoever takes Berlin will shape Europe." It is not a dramatic outburst. It is a weary recognition of geopolitical reality. When Berlin finally falls on April 30th, Truman inherits not just the presidency, but Roosevelt's unspoken fears, hopes, and the unfinished diplomatic puzzle left behind. April 30th, 1945. The message is clear and unmistakable. Soviet forces have taken Berlin. German resistance within the city has ceased. In the Oval Office, President Harry S. Truman removes his glasses and reads the decoded lines twice. His military advisors, General George Marshall, Admiral William Leahy, and Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, stand at quiet attention. They know the significance of this moment. Truman knows it too, but what weighs most heavily on him are the words of the man who is no longer in the room. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. During Roosevelt's final strategic meetings, he warned of this exact moment, not with panic and not with hostility, but with a kind of weary foresight. According to Marshall's later recollections, Roosevelt always expected the Russians would reach Berlin first. He believed the Red Army's advance was unstoppable once it broke through the Vistula. Roosevelt said in one January briefing, "They will take losses we could never justify to our people, and by doing so, they will arrive at the gates of Berlin before we can." Truman now feels the weight of those words. Marshall breaks the silence. "Mr. President, this will fundamentally shape the post-war map." Truman nods slowly. He remembers a conversation from the day Roosevelt died, when Stettinius quietly summarized Roosevelt's last concerns. Germany's defeat is certain, but the peace will be harder than the war. Roosevelt had reportedly told him weeks earlier, "The Russians will expect their share in Germany, and they will keep what they take." It was not a warning of confrontation. It was a recognition of geography, casualties, and political reality. Now, standing over a wooden desk that still smells faintly of Roosevelt cigarettes, Truman understands the meaning behind that statement. If Roosevelt foresaw the Soviet position, he also foresaw the consequences. A divided Europe, rival spheres of influence, a partnership turning into a competition. General Marshall places a hand on the report. "Sir, the question now is how we respond." Truman exhales, barely audible. He knows Roosevelt never witnessed this moment, but his voice feels present, shaping decisions even from beyond the grave. Roosevelt's private comment at Yalta echoes now, almost prophetically. "We must work with the Russians, but we must also be ready for what follows victory." The fall of Berlin is not just a military ending. It is a geopolitical beginning, one Roosevelt predicted and Truman must now face. May 1st, 3rd, 1945. News of Berlin's fall spreads across the Allied world with the force of an earthquake. For civilians, it signals that Nazi Germany's collapse is only days away. But inside the highest levels of Allied command, the reaction is far more complex. In Moscow, Stalin announces victory in Berlin with carefully crafted triumph. His message to Truman is polite but unmistakably assertive. The Soviet Union has delivered the decisive blow against Hitler. Soviet radio broadcasts describe the conquest of the Reich Chancellery, the storming of the Reichstag, and the raising of the Red Banner. It is not merely military reporting. It is the shaping of a narrative, the claim to moral and political authority in post-war Europe. In London, Churchill receives the news with mixed emotion. He is relieved the war in Europe is nearly over, but deeply uneasy about what Roosevelt once called the Russian position. Churchill writes privately to his staff, "The Russian bear has paws deep inside Europe." He worries about what will come next. But unlike Roosevelt, who believed personal diplomacy with Stalin could temper tensions, Churchill is already thinking in terms of strategic rivalry. In Washington, Truman convenes his first major strategic meeting since Berlin fell. He listens quietly as his advisors outline how the Soviet capture changes everything. General Marshall explains that millions of German civilians and soldiers are now under Soviet control. Admiral Leahy warns that Soviet occupation zones may harden into political ones. Stettinius reminds Truman that Roosevelt always believed cooperation was possible, but only if the Allies moved quickly to establish a stable post-war structure. Truman hears all of it, but what lingers most in his mind is one of Roosevelt's final strategic reflections, shared during a private conversation just weeks before his death. According to those present, Roosevelt said, "We must not greet the end of Nazi Germany with the beginning of mistrust among the victors, but the Russians will test us. They will test how firmly we stand. Now the test has begun." In the days following Berlin's fall, conflicting cables arrive from Europe. U.S. field commanders report cordial but cautious interactions with Soviet officers along the Elbe. British commanders warn of increasing Soviet assertiveness. Meanwhile, Soviet troops secure every major building in Berlin and begin reorganizing the city's political structure with astonishing speed. Roosevelt predicted that whoever took Berlin would set the terms of the immediate aftermath. Truman now watches that prediction unfold in real time and realizes the diplomatic world he has inherited is far more unstable than the military victory suggests. The fall of Berlin marks the symbolic end of Hitler's regime, but its long-term impact stretches far beyond the ruins of the German capital. What Roosevelt anticipated, and what Truman now confronts, is the transformation of wartime cooperation into a peacetime rivalry. In the months following victory in Europe, Soviet political authority expands rapidly across Eastern and Central Europe. The NKVD establishes security organs, communist parties are elevated, and pro-Soviet provisional governments emerge in Warsaw, Bucharest, Sofia, and Prague. Each step confirms Roosevelt's earlier assessment: military occupation shapes political destiny. Truman studies Roosevelt's notes repeatedly during the summer of 1945. Among them is a handwritten reminder from Yalta: "Trust, yes, but verify everything." Roosevelt believed that collaboration with the Soviets was possible, even necessary, but he also understood that Stalin's vision for Europe differed profoundly from the American one. Truman, now armed with this understanding, begins shifting toward a firmer posture. By late 1945, reports from American diplomats such as George Kennan warn of a widening ideological gulf. Churchill, acting on instincts Roosevelt had tried to balance with diplomacy, delivers his famous Iron Curtain speech in March 1946. Though controversial, the speech articulates publicly what Roosevelt had only expressed privately. Europe is dividing into spheres of influence, and the Soviet portion is expanding. This is not the world Roosevelt hoped to shape, nor is it entirely one he failed to foresee. Roosevelt repeatedly emphasized that preventing another global conflict required cooperation among the great powers. He envisioned the United Nations as the mechanism to manage that cooperation. But he also recognized a hard truth: if trust eroded, the very victors of World War II could drift toward confrontation. Truman, needing clarity in a rapidly shifting world, reflects often on Roosevelt's final warning to the Joint Chiefs. "The peace will be the real test. We must prepare for a world where our allies today may challenge us tomorrow." By 1947, this warning becomes reality. Aid programs, diplomatic standoffs, and strategic reorientations form the early architecture of what historians later call the Cold War. And at its foundation lies a single historical pivot: the moment the Soviet Union took Berlin. Roosevelt did not live to witness the divide he predicted, but his words, his caution, his foresight, his understanding of power and geography, become the intellectual bridge between World War II's closing chapter and the geopolitical world that follows. Berlin's fall marks the military end of Nazi Germany, but it also reveals a deeper truth about the nature of war and leadership. Victory is never a single moment. It is a chain of decisions, predictions, and human judgment stretching across years. For Roosevelt, the Soviet capture of Berlin was not a surprise. It was the culmination of geography, sacrifice, and political reality. He understood that the Red Army had paid the highest price in the European war, and that the capital of the Reich would inevitably fall to those who fought their way from Stalingrad to the Oder. Yet Roosevelt also recognized the paradox. The very alliance needed to defeat Hitler carried within it the seeds of future tension. His warnings were not prophecies of conflict, but quiet acknowledgments of how power behaves at the end of a global struggle. "The peace will be harder than the war," he said, and history proved him right. Truman, inheriting the Oval Office in the most turbulent spring of the 20th century, experienced those words as more than historical reflections. They became guides. They shaped the decisions he made in the weeks, months, and years after Berlin fell. Though Truman's leadership differed in style from Roosevelt's, his course was shaped by the foundation Roosevelt laid. Cooperate where possible, prepare where necessary, and understand the world as it is, not as one hopes it to be. When historians examine the moment Berlin fell, they see not only soldiers raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag or the ruins of a defeated empire. They also see a transition, a shift from global war to global tension, from alliance to rivalry, from the triumph of victory to the uncertainty of peace. Roosevelt did not live to witness the Cold War, but his words, spoken in private briefings and late-night strategy sessions, echo through Truman's presidency and into the decades that follow. They remind us that leadership in war is not only about defeating an enemy, it is about anticipating the world that emerges when the guns fall silent. And that is why Roosevelt's voice still matters when we look back on the day the Red Army took Berlin. It is the voice of a leader who understood that the end of one era is always the beginning of another.